The brain is made up of two halves, known as cerebral hemispheres. When looking at the brain from a lateral view, which just means looking at it from the side, we will only see one cerebral hemisphere, but the landmarks I will point out are found on both cerebral hemispheres. The surface of the cerebral hemispheres is covered with a thick layer of brain tissue known as the cerebral cortex. The cerebral cortex is folded to create more surface area, forming these ridges, known as gyri, and grooves, known as sulci. This large sulcus is known as the central sulcus. It divides the frontal lobe from the parietal lobe. This sulcus is known as the Sylvian fissure, and it separates the temporal lobe from the rest of the cerebral hemisphere. The occipital lobe is found at the back of the brain, but it doesn't have such a clear division separating it from the rest of the brain. There are certain functions associated with the lobes, but any short description of these functions is oversimplified, as each is involved in many different processes. The frontal lobes are important for movement and higher-order cognition like rational thought, decision-making, and planning. This area in front of the central sulcus is known as the precentral gyrus, and it is essential for motor control as it is the location of the primary motor cortex. The parietal lobes are important for processing of sensory information and are involved in attention and our representation of the space around us. This area in the parietal lobe, the postcentral gyrus, contains the primary somatosensory cortex and is where the sense of touch is processed. The temporal lobe is involved in processing auditory signals and also is important in aspects of learning and memory. The occipital lobes contain major visual processing areas of the brain like the primary visual cortex.
The primary somatosensory cortex is located in a ridge of cortex called the postcentral gyrus. It is situated just posterior to the central sulcus, a prominent fissure that runs down the side of the cerebral cortex. The primary somatosensory cortex is responsible for processing somatic sensations, or sensations from the body that include touch, proprioception, or the position of the body in space, nociception, or pain, and temperature. When receptors detect one of these sensations, the information is sent to the thalamus and then to the primary somatosensory cortex. The primary somatosensory cortex is typically divided into four areas: Area 3A, 3B, 1, and 2. Area 3 receives the majority of somatosensory input directly from the thalamus, and the initial processing of information occurs here. Area 3B is primarily concerned with basic processing of touch sensations, while Area 3A responds to information from proprioceptors. Area 3B is densely connected to Areas 1 and 2, and when Area 3B receives touch information, that information is then sent to Areas 1 and 2 for more complex processing. Area 2 is also involved with proprioception. Each of the four areas of the primary somatosensory cortex is arranged such that a particular location in that area receives information from a particular part of the body. This arrangement is referred to as somatotopic, and the full body is represented in this way in each of the four regions of the somatosensory cortex. More sensitive areas of the body take up a disproportionate amount of space in this somatotopic arrangement.
The motor cortex is a region of cortex in the frontal lobe that is involved with voluntary movement. It is located anterior to a large sulcus called the central sulcus, and is often divided into two major regions: the primary motor cortex and the non-primary motor cortex. The primary motor cortex is found in the strip of cortex known as the precentral gyrus, which is located just anterior to the central sulcus. The primary motor cortex is arranged such that different parts of the region are associated with motor control of different parts of the body, and thus is said to contain a motor map of the body. Most of the neurons that travel from the primary motor cortex carrying signals regarding movement will enter one of two major motor pathways: the corticospinal or corticobulbar tracts. The corticospinal tract carries movement-related signals to the spinal cord to cause movement of the body, while the corticobulbar tract carries signals to the brainstem to cause movement of the head, neck, and face. The non-primary motor cortex is often divided into two main regions, the supplementary motor cortex and the premotor cortex. Although the functions of these areas are not well understood, it is thought the supplementary motor cortex may be involved with the execution of sequences of movement, the attainment of motor skills, and the selection of movements based on incoming sensory information. The premotor cortex contributes about 30% of the neurons that enter the corticospinal tract, but seems to be more active during the planning of, rather than the execution of, movements.
Welcome to 2 Minute Neuroscience, where I explain neuroscience topics in 2 minutes or less. In this installment, I will discuss Wernick's area. Although there is some debate over the exact location of Wernick's area, it is typically considered to reside in the cortex of the left cerebral hemisphere, near the junction between the temporal and parietal lobes. Wernick's area was named for the German physician Karl Wernicke, who reported that damage to this region results in a deficit, where patients are able to produce speech that resembles fluent language, but actually is meaningless. The disorder came to be known as Wernick's aphasia, and patients who suffer from it do things like use made-up words or similar-sounding words substituted for one another to produce speech that makes little sense. Patients with Wernick's aphasia also suffer from a deficiency in their ability to understand language. Wernicke proposed a model for language that involved both the region he discovered and another language center, Broca'S area. Broca'S area is thought to play a role in speech production, and Wernicke's model, which was later expanded on by neurologist Norman Geschwind and called the Wernicke-Geschwind model, suggested that Wernicke's area creates plans for meaningful speech, while Broca'S area is responsible for taking those plans and determining the movements, like of the tongue and mouth, required to turn those plans into vocalizations. Although the anatomical definitions of Broca'S area are not completely consistent, it is generally considered to make up some part of a region called the inferior frontal gyrus, which is found in the frontal lobe. In the vast majority of individuals, Broca'S area resides in the left cerebral hemisphere. Broca'S area was named for the physician Paul Broca, who first identified the region as playing a potentially important role in speech production. Broca based this hypothesis on case studies of patients who had damage to the area and also displayed a deficit of speech. The particular condition Broca observed came to be known as Broca's aphasia and involves a deficit in the ability to produce language. In patients with Broca's aphasia, reading and writing are also often impaired, but language comprehension is typically relatively preserved.